Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine these hidden giants roaming the planet, right? Not like mythical monsters, but colossal forces of nature.
Yeah, shaping our world in really fundamental ways.
Exactly. They influence everything from, global climate patterns right down to the food chains that feed us.
Huge impact.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into one of these powerful, yet surprisingly cold giants, the Humboldt Current.
And this deep dive is particularly exciting because, well, it's tailored specifically around the stack of material you've shared with us about this incredible ocean system.
Exactly. So our mission here is to explore that material, pull out the most essential insights, really understand what makes this current so unique.
And why it matters so much.
Yes, why its influence is felt so strongly both, in the ocean and on land. Get ready to uncover some genuinely fascinating facts and hopefully connect some dots in new ways.
Okay, so where do we begin with the Humboldt Current? What is it, fundamentally?
At its core, it's this immense stream of cold, relatively low salinity water. Think of a river, basically, but in the ocean.
A massive one.
Huge. Flowing northwards right along the western edge of South America. It's what they call an eastern boundary current because it hugs that coastline, heading towards the equator.
And when we say immense, we really mean it. The information you've provided shows it starts way down in southern Chile, around 45 degrees south,
All right.
and stretches north all the way up to northern Peru, near 4 degrees south.
Wow.
That's where its cold water finally gives way to the warmer tropical stuff. It's something called the equatorial front.
And it's not just a narrow strip along the coast either. It pushes outwards, right?
Yeah.
Extending anywhere from 500 to 1,000 kilometers offshore.
Yeah, that's 310 to 620 miles out.
Incredible reach.
Historically, it's interesting. While it's named after the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, he documented his measurements in his 1846 book, Cosmos. The material you shared reminds us that actually the credit for discovery goes much further back.
Oh, yeah.
About 250 years earlier, to José de Acosta.
Okay. Good historical context there.
Definitely. But perhaps the most striking thing about it, and really key to understanding everything else, is its temperature.
Right. For a region firmly within the tropics, this water is just exceptionally cold.
Seriously. The data shows that off the coast of Peru, say around 5 degrees south, temperatures can drop to just 16 degrees Celsius. That's 61 Fahrenheit.
Which is bizarrely cold compared to typical tropical oceans, which are usually, above 25 C?
Yeah.
77 Fahrenheit.
Exactly. Way above that, usually. So this cold anomaly is fundamental.
It really sets the stage.
It does. But what's driving this massive cold river? Let's talk about the engine room, the physical processes.
Okay.
The primary force, the main driver pushing this current, is the trade winds.
Okay, so persistent winds are doing the heavy lifting.
Mm.
But, ocean systems are rarely that simple, are they? I imagine there's variability.
Oh, absolutely. The material you've compiled points to several things that make the system dynamic, always changing.
Like what?
Well, shifts in the intertropical convergence zone, that's the ITCZ, where trade winds from both hemispheres meet near the equator.
Right.
Changes in the South Pacific High, that big atmospheric pressure system, they play a role. The movement of the southern westerlies further south. Even cyclonic storms contribute. Plus, you've got coastal low-pressure systems, especially off central Chile, that kind of stir things up atmospherically closer to shore.
So it's this complex dance between global wind patterns and regional pressure systems creating the flow.
Pretty much, yeah. The current itself mainly sits in the upper layer of the ocean, carrying this fresh, cold, subantarctic surface water north.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is that off southern Peru, the main flow actually turns and heads more offshore.
It veers off.
Yeah, though a weaker part does keep going straight up towards the equator along the coast.
Does that cold water just stay separate, or does it mix with the surrounding ocean waters?
Oh, it definitely mixes. Around 18 degrees south, you see this cold water bumping up against warmer, saltier, subtropical surface waters.
And what happens then?
Well, this interaction can cause some of that cold water to sink a bit. It's called partial subduction. And beneath this main surface flow, the sources also mention some important undercurrents. There's the eastward equatorial undercurrent, the EUC, up in the north, and the poleward Peru-Chile undercurrent, the PCU, running the other way down south.
The material also flagged something called the coastal transition zone off central Chile. Said it had high eddy kinetic energy. What's going on there?
Yeah, that zone is incredibly dynamic, super energetic. It's an area known for a lot of turbulent mixing and these things called mesoscale eddies.
Eddies, like big whirlpools.
Basically, yeah. large swirling masses of water, sometimes tens or even hundreds of kilometers across. It's just a region of high energy where different water masses are really interacting intensely.
Got it.
The sources also point out these distinct regions where chlorophyll is really high. Chlorophyll is, a good indicator of phytoplankton.
The base of the food web.
Exactly. So there's like a wide band off Peru between 10 and 15 degrees south, another wide one off central Chile around 30 south, and then a narrower one off northern Chile.
And it seems like the highest concentration is pretty close to the coast, right? Within about 50 kilometers.
Generally, yes. That coastal zone is where the action is.
So lots of primary production, that basic life, concentrated near the coast. And the main reason for that is really the key to the whole system, isn't it?
Precisely. This is the Humboldt Current's secret weapon, coastal upwelling.
That's when the deep water comes up to the surface.
Yes, exactly. The winds, especially those trade winds blowing along the coast, push the surface water offshore.
Okay.
And when that surface water moves away, deeper water has to rise up to replace it.
And that deep water is special.
It's loaded with nutrients, nitrates, phosphates, silicates, all the stuff that's sunk down from decaying organic matter over time. Bringing those nutrients up into the sunlit surface waters is like constantly fertilizing the ocean.
Wow.
Your material describes three main types of upwelling subsystems here. You've got seasonal upwelling off Chile, mostly spring and summer. Then there's this large, but actually less intensely productive upwelling shadow area off northern Chile and southern Peru. That's roughly between 35 and 15 degrees south.
An upwelling shadow. What causes that?
It seems to be caused by the influence of the big, nutrient-poor subtropical gyre pushing up against the coast, creating this sort of narrow zone with its own dynamics.
Interesting. And the third type?
That's the really big one. The exceptionally productive year-round upwelling off the coast of Peru. That's the powerhouse.
An upwelling shadow. That sounds fascinating. So the sheer size of that subtropical gyre creates this specific narrow zone.
Exactly. It's a subtle feature maybe, but significant for how the system is structured.
Okay, so we've got cold water, wind-driven flow, powerful upwelling bringing up tons of nutrients leading to immense productivity.
Yeah.
But the sources also reveal a challenging twist within this incredibly productive system.
Ah, yes.
The oxygen minimum zone, or OMZ.
Yes, this is a really critical and maybe somewhat counterintuitive feature. Just below the surface, going from subsurface down to intermediate depths, there's this huge layer where oxygen levels are extremely low.
Hypoxic conditions.
That's the term, yes, hypoxic.
So all this life-giving productivity is also creating a zone where many things literally can't breathe.
Yeah.
That feels like a paradox.
It really does. And the OMZ is formed mainly for two reasons. First, there's limited ventilation. Remember how we said the main current veers offshore near Peru?
Yeah.
Well, that reduces the amount of oxygen-rich surface water that can mix downwards.
Okay, less mixing in.
And second, and this is crucial, it's a direct consequence of all that incredible productivity at the surface.
Right.
All that phytoplankton eventually dies, sinks.
Right.
And as bacteria decompose it in the deeper water, they use up enormous amounts of oxygen in the process.
So the very engine of life is also consuming the oxygen needed for life deeper down. Wild.
Precisely. And this zone isn't small. Your material highlights it as the fourth largest permanent hypoxic zone in the entire world.
Fourth largest.
Yeah.
Wow.
It occupies an area of about, 2.18 million cubic kilometers, plus or minus. The core of it is off Peru. And its upper boundary is surprisingly shallow.
How shallow?
Sometimes starting as high up as only 100 meters deep and then extending down to maybe 600 meters.
100 meters is not very deep at all in ocean terms.
No, it's relatively shallow, and that has profound implications for marine life. Now, there is some oxygenation happening from the equatorial undercurrent in the north, and the Peru-Chile undercurrent pushes some low oxygen water south. But the zone remains a major feature, a barrier.
So how does that shallow, oxygen-depleted layer actually impact the animals living there?
Well, it basically forces many organisms to stay squeezed into that relatively narrow band between the shallow OMZ boundary and the surface.
Where they can get oxygen and food.
Exactly. Oxygen and the nutrients near the surface. For instance, it restricts the daily vertical migrations of zooplankton, the tiny animals crucial to the food web. They can't dive as deep. However, this restriction on movement, interestingly, might actually help with significant carbon exchange between the surface and the OMZ itself.
So even in its low oxygen state, it's still playing a big role in the global carbon cycle.
Yes, it's an active part of the whole biogeochemical cycling process. And it also provides a potential refuge for organisms that are actually tolerant of low oxygen conditions. Some things can handle it.
Despite that challenge of the OMZ, it's clear the overall picture painted by the sources is one of just immense biological abundance.
Oh, absolutely. Because of that constant nutrient-rich upwelling, the Humboldt Current system is classified as a Class I, highly productive ecosystem.
Class I.
Meaning really, really productive. The data you've reviewed shows it generating over 300 grams of carbon per square meter per year through just primary production, phytoplankton growth.
That's powering a lot of life.
It really is. It creates the foundation for an incredibly diverse and complex food web. The conditions are just perfect for these massive phytoplankton blooms.
Which then feeds everything else.
Everything else. The sources list a huge variety. Multiple species of plankton, mollusks, sea urchins, crustaceans, countless fish species, marine mammals, the whole shebang.
It's that classic bottom-up cascade effect, isn't it? Nutrients feed the phytoplankton, phytoplankton feed the zooplankton, zooplankton feed the small fish.
Which feed the bigger fish and the birds and the mammals.
Exactly. It's this explosive productivity that makes it one of the most important marine ecosystems on Earth, period.
And that immense productivity translates directly into something of massive global economic importance. Fisheries.
Yeah, this system hosts some of the most successful commercial fisheries anywhere in the world. The information you've gathered points out that it accounts for roughly, 18 to 20% of the total global marine fish catch.
18 to 20%.
Yeah.
From one current system.
It's an astonishing proportion coming from just this one region. Really highlights its importance.
So what are the main species they're catching? They're largely pelagic species, the ones that live out in the open water column. Things like sardines, anchovies, mackerel, hake, squid. Those are the big ones mentioned.
Are these fish populations kind of spread uniformly, or are there distinct groups, distinct stocks?
No, the sources detail pretty specific stock distributions. For example, they talk about 3 major anchoveta stocks found between 4 and 42 degrees south latitude.
Right.
The fishery off north-central Peru mainly focuses on just one of those stocks. Then southern Peru and northern Chile, they're known for a major sardine fishery, but also a second anchoveta stock.
And further south.
Central Chile, the primary commercial catches include anchoveta again, jack mackerel, and sardines. So different areas specialize a bit.
And where do these different fish tend to hang out relative to the current's features, like the upwelling?
Well, anchoveta seem to prefer those recently upwelled waters, so they stay pretty close to the coast.
Makes sense where the food is blooming.
Exactly. Sardines, on the other hand, are generally found a bit farther offshore. And there's an interesting detail from your sources about timing. The timing of seasonal upwelling, especially in late winter, seems really crucial for the survival of fish eggs and larvae.
How so?
Well, moderate upwelling conditions during that period are apparently ideal. They're less turbulent, maybe, and less likely to sweep the tiny vulnerable larvae too far away from the coast via something called Ekman drift.
So really subtle changes in the current's dynamics, even just the strength of upwelling at a certain time, can have massive impacts on whether the next generation of fish survives.
Absolutely. These populations are incredibly sensitive to the specific conditions created by the current. And critically, the sources really highlight how their populations shift, sometimes dramatically with climate changes, and especially with events like El Niño.
Because their habitat changes.
Exactly. The available, suitable habitat changes. And since anchoveta, for example, are such a fundamental food source for so many other animals in the system, birds, bigger fish, mammals, shifts in their population just reverberate throughout the entire ecosystem's energy processing. It's all connected.
Let's maybe look at a couple of the specific fishery examples mentioned in the material. Jack mackerel, or gerl, you said that's a major one, second largest.
That's right. It's believed to be a single stock, mostly, and it's considered a straddling species.
Straddling?
Meaning its distribution spans both inside and outside the 200-mile exclusive economic zones, the EEZs of the coastal countries. Makes management tricky.
I bet.
Its importance really grew in the 1970s.
But it faced some challenges later on.
Yeah, in the 1980s, there was a significant decline. The sources point to poor recruitment, meaning not enough young fish were surviving to replenish the population.
Okay.
Coupled with, well, overfishing, classic combo. Restrictions were put in place in 1998, which helped the stock recover somewhat.
And since then?
Since 2002, it's generally been classified as fully exploited, meaning fished at pretty much the maximum sustainable level.
And the Peruvian hake fishery also saw a decline.
Yeah.
Right?
It did, yeah. The period between about 1993 and 2008 saw a major drop, again, attributed in the sources to a mix of factors. Overfishing, environmental stress, and reduced reproduction rates. Your material also notes a significant decrease in the Chilean hake catch by around 2007 as well. So struggles in multiple areas.
So clearly there's incredible potential for harvest in this system, but also a real vulnerability to both human pressure, like overfishing, and these big environmental shifts.
Definitely.
And speaking of environmental shifts, the influence of El Nino on this system sounds dramatic.
It's perhaps the single most powerful disruptor. El Nino and its counterpart La Nina, they profoundly alter the productivity of the entire Humboldt Current system.
So what actually happens during an El Nino event specifically? What changes?
During an El Nino, the whole vertical structure of the ocean there changes dramatically. The thermocline, that boundary layer between the warm surface water and the cold, deeper water, and the upper edge of the oxygen minimum zone we talked about, the OMZ, they both deepen significantly, sometimes dropping below 600 meters down.
Wow, 600 meters. And what does that do?
It essentially shuts off the critical nutrient supply from upwelling. The deep, nutrient-rich water just can't get to the surface anymore.
So it cuts out the fertilizer.
Exactly, cuts off the fertilizer. And the consequence for that biological engine?
Not good, I'm guessing.
Not good at all. It leads to significant nitrogen loss. Nitrogen's a key nutrient, and a big decrease in the export of carbon from the surface down. Also, the poleward currents tend to intensify.
And how does that compare to normal non-El Nino years?
It's a stark contrast. In non-El Nino years, productivity is sky high because you've got that constant nutrient influx, really efficient nutrient recycling happening, high carbon export, remineralization.
Yeah.
The whole system is humming.
So El Nino basically starves the surface waters of the very nutrients that normally fuel its incredible productivity.
That's a really good way to put it. Starves the surface. And the consequences for the fisheries are, well, severe. Yeah.
El Nino events drastically impact fish abundance and where they're distributed. They often lead to population crashes,
Right.
which then have devastating social and economic ripple effects for the communities that depend entirely on fishing.
And the material also discussed something called regime shifts. What's that about?
Yeah, this is a fascinating pattern that scientists have observed in the system over longer timescales. El Nino periods seem linked to these shifts where sardines and anchovies periodically kind of swap places as the dominant species.
One crashes and the other takes over.
Pretty much. One population collapses, maybe due to the El Nino conditions or fishing pressure or both, and the other one explodes to fill the gap. Now, while the total amount of fish biomass might remain relatively high overall,
Okay.
the shift in which species is dominant has major negative consequences for the fishing industry because fleets and processing plants are often geared towards catching one species or the other.
Ah, I see. You can't just easily switch targets. Not easily, no. And the most famous historical example of this is that 1972 anchoveta collapse in Peru.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
It's a classic case study. In the 1960s, the Peruvian anchoveta fishery was just booming, unbelievable catches, over 12 million tons per year by 1970.
12 million tons?
Yeah, making it something like 20% of the entire world's fish catch at the time.
Wow.
Then the strong 1972 El Nino hit, and the anchoveta population just collapsed, spectacularly.
And the sardines?
Following that collapse, sardine populations surged over the next 15 to 20 years. So you saw the growth of sardine fisheries during that period. That's the regime shift in action. It really underscores how sensitive this whole system is to these large-scale climate events.
Absolutely. Now, beyond the ocean itself, the Humboldt Current also has a profound influence on the climate of the land next to it, right?
Oh, definitely. It has a significant cooling effect on the coastal regions of Chile, Peru, and even Ecuador further north.
Cooling effect.
Yeah. And perhaps its most well-known impact on land is its crucial role in creating the extreme aridity, the dryness of the Atacama Desert in northern Chile.
One of the driest places on Earth.
Exactly. And also, the coastal areas of Peru and southern Ecuador are very dry because of it, too.
How does a cold ocean current make a desert so dry? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, think about the air passing over that very cold current. It gets cooled down, right? And it also becomes very stable.
Okay.
So when this cool, stable marine air reaches the warmer land, it just doesn't have the buoyancy to rise very high. It can't rise enough to form rain-producing clouds.
It just sits low.
It sits low. It does, however, often create low-lying clouds and fog, coastal fog, sometimes called Camanchaca or Garua.
Right, I've heard of that.
And that fog is actually a key source of moisture for some really unique coastal desert ecosystems, and even for things like astronomical observatories, like the La Silla Observatory mentioned in your sources. It's in an incredibly dry area, but relies on that coastal fog influence indirectly.
So a cold current is directly linked to desert fog. That is a counterintuitive connection.
It really highlights the current's sweeping atmospheric influence. It also, along with the associated wind patterns, tends to inhibit the formation of tropical cyclones in that part of the Pacific.
Which might otherwise bring rain.
Which might otherwise bring significant rainfall. Yeah. So it reinforces the dryness in multiple ways.
So, okay, we've journeyed through the core elements of this cold, low-salinity giant flowing northward along South America. We've explored its powerful engine, the trade winds, and that critical upwelling, revealing how those vital nutrients get brought to the surface.
Yeah, the fertilization process.
We've grappled with the paradox of the oxygen minimum zone it helps create and how life has to navigate that low oxygen challenge.
A really unique feature.
We've celebrated the absolute explosion of life this system supports, fueling some of the world's most important fisheries.
Truly world-class fisheries.
And we've really understood the dramatic, disruptive power of El Niño events, how they can crash populations and shift the entire ecosystem balance.
Major disruptions.
And finally, we've seen how its cold influence reaches onto land, shaping the climate, giving rise to incredibly arid deserts and even specific types of fog. This is the remarkable picture that emerges when you really delve into the material you've provided about this system.
Yeah, and what's particularly striking, I think, is how intricately linked everything is here. You can't separate the physical oceanography, the currents, the temperatures from the unique chemistry, especially defined by that low oxygen layer.
Right.
And the vibrant biology that either thrives because of these conditions or is constrained by them. It's just this constant dynamic interplay.
It really is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it kind of leaves us with a big question to ponder, doesn't it? Considering that history, we talked about these immense fishery booms, followed by devastating busts, often tied to natural climate cycles like El Niño, but also human pressures. How do we effectively and sustainably manage these absolutely vital world-class resources, especially in a rapidly changing global climate?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And what does the future hold for the communities and the entire ecosystems that depend so heavily on this incredibly productive, yet clearly vulnerable cold giant? Something to think about. That sound. It's just instantly recognizable, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Lightning fast. Pure Bruce Lee.
Yeah. It conjures up this image of incredible discipline, just raw power. We are diving deep today into the life and really the legacy of a true icon, Bruce Lee.
And we're using a pretty comprehensive Wikipedia article as our main source. It really does trace his whole extraordinary journey.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to maybe get past just the famous kicks and the movie posters. We want to find those key insights, those nuggets of knowledge. What's the story beyond the legend?
Okay, let's jump in. So Bruce Lee, born Lee Junfan, San Francisco, November 1940. And right away, something interesting from the source, that name Junfan. His mother chose it. It means return again. She apparently predicted he'd come back to the U.S. someday.
Wow. And Bruce, that was different.
Yeah, the article says that was just a name given by a hospital physician, kind of random almost.
Huh. So even his name has this layer of story. Now, his background. The source mentions his father was a famous Cantonese opera star.
That's right. Which meant young Bruce was actually in films from, like, infancy. His first role was literally as a baby.
No kidding.
Yeah. And while he grew up in Hong Kong during a pretty rough time, gangs, street fights, his family was actually quite well off. His mother came from the prominent Hotungs clan.
So there's this interesting mix the source highlights privilege, but also this gritty street-level environment.
Exactly. A real paradox. And that definitely shaped him. His first martial art wasn't even Wing Chun, it was Tai Chi.
Oh, okay. Taught by his father.
Yep. The Wing Chun, the really pivotal stuff with Ip Man, that came later, around around 16 or 17.
Right, the Ip Man connection is legendary, but the article mentions getting into that school wasn't automatic.
No, not at all. Because of his mixed heritage, his mother had European ancestry. There was some initial reluctance, apparently, traditional circles and all that. A friend had to kind of vouch for him, help him get accepted.
That's a fascinating detail. Shows that friction was there early on. And he trained mostly with senior students, not Ip Man directly all the time.
Yeah, the source notes Ip Man focused more on the advanced guys. So Bruce trained a lot with people like Wang Shenlong and William Chung, very hands-on.
Right, and we have to remember the context. Hong Kong, in the 50s and 60s. Street fighting was common.
Oh, yeah. The article talks about rooftop fights, sort of settling disputes or self-defense. Bruce was apparently involved quite a bit.
So this wasn't just theoretical training in a dojo.
Not at all. It was real, chaotic application. And that practical experience, the source really emphasizes, was fundamental to how he thought about martial arts later.
And it's also why he left Hong Kong, right? Things got a bit too heated.
Seems like it. The article mentions increasingly frequent fights, one even involving the police. So his parents decided it was time to send him back to the U.S., claim that birthright citizenship.
So a pretty dramatic exit leads him to America, Seattle specifically. He worked, finished high school, and then university.
Yep, University of Washington. And this is where you really see his intellectual side starting to emerge in the source material.
Okay. What did he study? Was it like physical education?
He did study drama, which makes sense. But also, interestingly, psychology and philosophy.
Psychology and philosophy, huh? How did those fit in?
Well, according to the source, for Bruce, martial arts wasn't just physical. It was deeply connected to self-expression, self-knowledge. So philosophy and psychology gave him maybe a framework, a way to analyze movement, tradition, human potential.
Okay, that makes sense. Thinking about the why behind the what.
Exactly. And it's in Seattle he starts teaching his own thing, calling it Junfan Gung Fu.
Which the source describes as basically his take on Wing Chun, right? Adapted.
Pretty much, his early interpretation. And notably, even back then, his student group was apparently very racially diverse for a Chinese martial arts school at the time, already pushing boundaries.
And Taki Kimura was his first assistant instructor there.
That's right. Then he moves from Seattle down to Oakland, co-founds another studio, this time with James Yim Lee.
Okay. And this period leads up to a really significant event, the article details. The 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships.
Ah, yeah. This was huge. His demonstrations there were apparently mind-blowing. The two-finger push-ups.
And the one-inch punch.
The legendary one-inch punch. The source mentions the guy who took it, Bob Baker, said his chest hurt for days. It really showed off that explosive power from almost no distance.
Incredible. But it wasn't just the physical display, was it? The article says he also used that platform to critique things.
Yeah, that's a really key point from the source. He publicly criticized classical martial arts styles, argued they were too rigid, needed modernization, needed to discard things that just weren't practical in a real situation.
Wow, that must have ruffled some feathers in the traditional martial arts world.
Oh, you bet. A very bold, very public challenge. And it kind of directly leads into the next major controversial event.
The Oakland Challenge fight.
Exactly. The private match with Wang Jackman, also in 1964. And the source lays out these dramatically conflicting accounts. It's fascinating.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the story according to Bruce Lee's side?
So, according to Bruce, his wife Linda, and James Yim Lee, the Chinese martial arts community basically gave Bruce an ultimatum. Stop teaching non-Chinese students or fight their representative, Wang Jackman. Bruce refused to stop teaching, so the fight happened.
And their version of the fight itself.
They say it was short, like 3 minutes. Decisive victory for Bruce. Wang supposedly gave up.
Right. Now, what's the other side of the story, according to the source?
Wang Jackman and another witness, William Chen, tell a very different story. They claim Wang challenged Lee after Lee had been boasting he could beat anyone in San Francisco.
Ah, so a different reason for the fight entirely.
Right. And they say the fight lasted way longer, 20, maybe 25 minutes. They claim Lee attacked aggressively, maybe unfairly, while Wang held back from using potentially lethal techniques, though Wang admitted using some illegal moves himself. Their account ends with Lee being unusually winded, the fight stopping because of his condition, not a clear knockout or submission.
Wow. Those are completely different realities of the same event.
Yeah.
How does the source guide us on this? Does it pick a side?
No, it presents both accounts neutrally. It does note that Lee didn't take Wang up on an offer for a public rematch, but he also definitely kept teaching non-Chinese students.
Yeah.
But here's the really crucial part, the impact. The article emphasizes that even in Bruce's own version, where he won quickly, he was deeply unhappy with his performance.
Unhappy, even though he won.
Yeah, he felt it took too long, he got too winded, and critically, he felt traditional Wing Chun, his base, was too limited, too formalized for the sheer chaos of a real no-rules fight.
So that feeling, that dissatisfaction, was the spark.
Exactly. That experience is presented as the direct catalyst for him developing his own philosophy and system, which led to, in 1967, Jeet Kune Do, JKD, the way of the intercepting fist.
So JKD wasn't just a new style, it was a response.
A direct response. The source describes it as a hybrid philosophy. It drew from everything he found useful. Wing Chun, yes, but also boxing, footwork, fencing principles, judo throws, wrestling. He trained with Jean Labelle, learned grappling, even studied Muhammad Ali's movement.
Taking the best bits from everywhere.
Yeah.
The style of no-style idea.
That's the core concept. Adaptability. Intercepting the opponent's attack, not just blocking and then hitting, moving beyond rigid forms. The source even says he later kind of regretted the name Jeet Kune Do because any name implies structure, parameters, which was the very thing he wanted to move beyond.
Fascinating evolution. From street fighter to demonstrator to dissatisfied winner to philosopher creator. And this evolution then leads him back towards performance, right? Back to acting.
Yeah, after that Long Beach demo caught people's attention, he auditioned and landed Kato in The Green Hornet, 1966-67.
Which was a pretty big deal for representation back then, wasn't it?
Huge. First popular American show really featuring Asian-style martial arts prominently. And the source has that great detail about him having to actually slow down his movements.
Because he was too fast for the camera.
Literally too fast for the cameras they were using. He also trained with stuntman Jean Labelle quite a bit during this time, the article mentions, exchanging striking techniques for grappling knowledge.
So after Green Hornet, he had his own ideas for a show, The Warrior.
Right. He pitched this concept for a Western series starring a Shaolin monk in the American West. But then Warner Bros. Developed the show Kung Fu, starring David Carradine.
And the source presents different reasons why Bruce wasn't cast.
Yeah, it's another point of contention. Lee and Linda felt his concept was basically stolen or heavily borrowed without credit. Warner Bros. And some biographers cited reasons like his accent being too thick for a lead role, or simply that American audiences weren't ready for an Asian lead, ethnicity being the barrier.
Contentious history there.
Definitely. And feeling pretty disillusioned with these kinds of supporting roles or near misses in Hollywood.
He heads back to Hong Kong.
Right, in 1971. And he was apparently genuinely surprised at how famous he was there. The Green Hornet had been aired as The Kato Show and was a massive hit.
So he was already a star there, just didn't quite realize it.
Exactly. Golden Harvest quickly signed him, and then, boom. His career just exploded.
The Big Boss, 1971. Huge success.
Massive across Asia. Then Fist of Fury in 72 broke those records. He became this colossal star almost overnight in that market.
And then he took the reins himself, right, with Way of the Dragon?
Yeah, 1972. He wrote it, directed it, starred in it, choreographed the fights. Total creative control. That's the one with the iconic fight against Chuck Norris in the Roman Coliseum.
The classic scene. And these films were making serious money.
Hundreds of millions worldwide, adjusted for inflation, according to the source, which really set the stage perfectly for the big one. Enter the Dragon.
1973. The first U.S.-Hong Kong co-production of its kind, right? Actually paused his work on another project.
Yeah, he put his passion project, Game of Death, on hold to make Enter the Dragon. And the success was just astronomical. The source highlights the numbers. Budget around $850,000, worldwide gross over $400 million.
Wow. Adjusted for inflation, that's
It's over $2 billion today. Staggering return.
And that film just cemented his global legendary status. It basically launched the whole kung fu craze in the West in the 70s.
Absolutely. Now, the source also mentions the story with Game of Death. It was finished after he died, but the 1978 release used a lot of lookalikes, stand-ins. Only about 15 minutes of actual footage shot by Bruce Lee himself made it into that version.
So not really his film in the end.
Not the way he envisioned it, no. The original footage he shot eventually came out in documentaries later, but interestingly, that original concept he pitched, The Warrior, it's now actually being developed as a TV series decades later based on his own writings and concepts.
Full circle, in a way. But underpinning all that on-screen charisma and action was this incredibly disciplined approach to fitness and martial arts philosophy.
Totally. The source really emphasizes how groundbreaking his approach to physical conditioning was for martial artists back then. He wasn't a huge guy, maybe 5'8", around 140 pounds.
But incredibly strong and fit.
Unbelievably. After that Wong Jackman fight, he became convinced that most martial artists seriously neglected conditioning. Strength, cardio, flexibility, he pursued total fitness.
Treating the body like a performance machine, as the source puts it.
Exactly. And nutrition was a huge part of that. Health foods, protein drinks he mixed himself, vitamins, supplements. He avoided processed foods, baked goods, refined flour, preferred traditional Asian cuisine, saw food as high-octane fuel.
And his training integrated so many different things. It wasn't just Wing Chun anymore.
Not by a long shot. Wing Chun was the base, sure. But the source details how he incorporated Muhammad Ali's footwork, grappling techniques from judo and catch wrestling, learned from Jean Labelle elements of Hapkido, boxing.
Popularizing things like the one-inch punch, the oblique kick.
Right, the jeet tech, or stop kick. And using grappling moves very strategically in his film choreography, which was quite innovative then.
But it wasn't just the physical, was it? The source mentions the mental and spiritual side being just as important to him.
Absolutely fundamental. There's a great quote cited, "JKD is not a matter of petty techniques, but of highly developed spirituality and physique." It was holistic.
Which ties back to his studies in philosophy at university.
Definitely. He wasn't just repeating moves, he was thinking deeply about them. The source highlights his extensive personal library, his deep interest in philosophy. He saw martial arts as a vehicle for self-discovery.
And his influences were really broad.
Incredibly. Taoism, Buddhism, sure, but also Western thinkers like Plato, Descartes, Hume, and Eastern figures like Lao Tzu, Krishnamurti, Miyamoto Musashi. He was constantly reading, learning, synthesizing.
The source also mentions his views on formal religion.
Yeah, pretty direct. When asked, he apparently stated none whatsoever regarding religious affiliation and expressed doubt about the existence of God, saying something like, "To be perfectly frank, I really do not."
And another layer, the source points out, he was a poet.
Yeah, maybe a lesser-known side. His poetry is described as another form of self-expression, sometimes quite intense or dark, reflecting his inner world. And his style, free verse, kind of mirrored his philosophy being formless, adaptable like water.
So when you put all these pieces together, the fighter, the film star, the philosopher, the fitness guru, the poet, his legacy becomes immense.
Truly immense. The source rightly calls him one of the most influential martial artists ever, a massive pop culture icon who bridged East and West like few others. Time magazine recognized him as one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century.
His impact on film is undeniable. He didn't just star in kung fu movies, he essentially created the global kung fu craze.
And fundamentally changed how Asian martial arts were portrayed in Western cinema. Enter the Dragon's influence on action filmmaking is still felt today. So many filmmakers and action stars cite him as a primary inspiration.
And beyond film, in actual combat sports.
JKD's philosophy is seen as a direct precursor to modern mixed martial arts. The source even quotes Dana White, calling him the father of mixed martial arts.
Because of that idea of taking what works from any style.
Exactly. Blending, striking, grappling, footwork, the core concept of MMA. Specific techniques he popularized, like the oblique kick, are still used. His influence on kickboxing development is also noted.
And culturally, his impact went beyond martial arts. The source stresses his role in challenging stereotypes.
Hugely important, particularly the stereotype of the emasculated Asian male that was so common in Hollywood then. He presented an image of an Asian man who was powerful, confident, charismatic, tough, strong, and sexy, as the article puts it.
A rare, non-white, global superstar at that time, a source of immense pride and inspiration, especially for Asian Americans.
Absolutely. And the reach of his influence is just staggering when you look at the list in the source. Comedians, musicians, athletes, comic books. Stan Lee said he was an inspiration for Shang-Chi.
Breakdancing, Bollywood, anime, manga, video games.
Yeah, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, countless others owe him a debt. Even parkour.
It's incredible. And the tributes reflect that global reach. Statues in LA, Hong Kong, and Mostar in Bosnia.
Yeah, put up specifically as a symbol against ethnic division, a unifying figure. There's mention of theme parks, plans for preserving his home. His image is still everywhere in advertising, too.
Now, the source also touches briefly on his personal life, his marriage to Linda Emery.
Which had to be kept secret initially in 1964 because of anti-miscegenation laws still in effect then.
Wow. And they had 2 children, Brandon and Shannon.
Right. Brandon tragically followed his father into acting and also died young in an accident on a film set. Shannon has been very active in preserving and promoting her father's legacy, his philosophies, and martial arts.
He also had a really interesting circle of friends and students, didn't he? A mix of martial arts and Hollywood.
Definitely. The pallbearers at his funeral tell a story. Steve McQueen, James Coburn, Dan Santo, Taki Kimura. Others mentioned include Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Chuck Norris, Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate. Quite a network.
The source also includes a more complex detail from his private life.
Label.
Letters.
Yes, it factually reports on the existence of private letters, apparently from the late 60s to early 70s, where he requested mailings of substances like cocaine, painkillers, and psilocybin for his personal use. It's presented as a documented finding.
Okay. Which brings us sadly to his death, so young, only 32. The source outlines the events. There was an earlier collapse.
Yes, in May 1973, he collapsed during an editing session. He was diagnosed then with cerebral edema swelling of the brain, but recovered.
And then, just 2 months later, July 20th, 1973.
He was at the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei, reportedly discussing a script. He complained of a headache, took a painkiller Equagesic, which contains aspirin and a tranquilizer, lay down for a nap, and couldn't be woken up. He was pronounced dead at the hospital.
And the cause of death. The source makes it clear this is still debated.
Very much so. It lays out the main theories. The official coroner's finding at the time was death by misadventure,
Meaning?
meaning an adverse hypersensitive reaction to the Equagesic, causing the cerebral edema to return fatally. The pathologist noted cannabis was present, but ruled it unrelated to the cause of death.
Okay, that was the official verdict. But there are other theories.
Yes. Matthew Polly, in his 2018 biography, consulted medical experts and proposed that the cerebral edema might have been triggered or worsened by heat stroke, possibly linked to extreme overexertion. And the article connects this theory to the controversial report that Lee had sweat glands removed from his armpits.
Which could have impaired his body's cooling mechanism.
Potentially, yes. That's the hypothesis presented. Then there's a more recent theory from a 2022 medical study, also noted in the source.
What's that one?
This study suggests the cause was hyponatremia, basically, dangerously low sodium levels in the body, leading to cerebral edema.
What would cause that?
They link it to several factors mentioned in accounts of his life around that time. Potentially excessive water intake, maybe combined with a diet low in solutes, use of diuretics, alcohol consumption, maybe prescription drug use, things that could overload the kidney's ability to excrete water. They argue his symptoms align with known cases.
So, multiple medical theories, none universally accepted, and the source also acknowledges the rumors that circulated. Triads, curses.
It mentions them briefly as part of the public discussion and mystery surrounding his death, but focuses on the medical debates based on available evidence and expert opinions presented in various materials.
Okay, so we've covered this incredible journey. From Hong Kong kid navigating 2 worlds, to the innovator in Seattle and Oakland, the global phenomenon on screen, the deep thinker and philosopher, and finally, the unresolved questions around his sudden death.
It really underscores how he was so much more than just a fighter or a movie star. The source material paints a picture of relentless evolution, constant questioning, this drive for self-expression through physicality and intellect. Breaking barriers wasn't just something that happened to him, it was something he actively did.
Absolutely. And maybe that final point, the ongoing debate about his death, even decades later. Perhaps it reminds us, that even with someone so iconic, so seemingly known, there are always more layers. Understanding a legacy like Bruce Lee's is maybe like his own philosophy.
A process of continuous learning,
Right.
taking what's useful, questioning the rest, always adapting.
Exactly. Something to keep exploring, just like he did.
When you hear Bedouin, what comes to mind? Is it that classic image, the solitary figure, the endless dunes?
Yeah, the romanticized view.
Right. And while there's maybe a hint of truth there, the real story of the Bedouin people is, well, it's much richer, far more complex, and always evolving.
Definitely.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the source material you've shared on the Bedouin. These are historically, pastorally nomadic Arab tribes. Their story is really woven into the deserts across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, the Levant.
Mesopotamia, too.
Yeah.
Big
It's
area.
huge. And it's worth remembering the name itself, Bedouin. It comes from the Arabic Badawa, basically just means desert dweller.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and it contrasts them with the settled people. So the name itself points to that traditional lifestyle.
Got it. So our mission here is to really explore these sources you've given us. They cover, well, everything from origins, social structures.
Unique traditions, how they've navigated huge historical shifts. Exactly. We want to unpack all that and pull out the most important knowledge, the key insights about the Bedouin people, just for you listening.
And the sources, they really do offer a fascinating window. You see centuries of change, remarkable adaptation. Let's jump in.
Okay, let's start with the basics. Who are the Bedouin traditionally? The sources define them as nomadic Arab tribes living in these vast desert regions.
That's the historical heartland, yeah.
Yeah.
And after Islam spread, Bedouin groups expanded massively right across the Arab world, West Asia, North Africa,
Carrying that identity with them.
carrying that desert dweller identity, that culture, yes.
And the sources highlight their traditional social setup divided into tribes or clans. The Arabic terms are ashir or kabal.
Correct. And their shared culture, fundamentally built around herding livestock. That was central.
But here's a critical point, right? That tension between the historical nomadic image and today's reality.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
While they're defined historically by being on the move, the vast majority of Bedouin today are settled, often in towns, cities, sometimes built specifically for them by governments.
Which is where it gets really interesting because despite that shift, many urban Bedouins are, actively trying to keep traditions alive. The sources mention things like cultural festivals, camel riding, desert camping, but as leisure now, even like traditional tent weaving classes.
It's a conscious effort. It's not just a past identity they remember. It's something they're actively preserving, adapting for modern life. It's quite remarkable.
Okay, let's dig into the society itself. There's this saying the sources quote a lot.
Yes. I is against my brother and I are against my cousin and I are against the stranger. It really sums up their traditional structure.
So how did that actually work day to day? What did the sources say? That thing sounds like a clear hierarchy of loyalties.
It is radiating outwards. Individual, immediate family, clan, then the wider tribe. And it wasn't just a saying. This was the practical basis for everything, settling disputes, pursuing group interests, maintaining justice, order, all through self-help and collective responsibility within that tribal structure.
And the basic unit.
The family unit, living together in a tent, the bait. Typically maybe 3 or 4 adults and their kids.
And the core values holding it all together, what do the sources emphasize?
Consistently you see courage, generous hospitality, that's a big one, fierce loyalty to family and tribe, and a real pride in ancestry.
These weren't just ideals, were they? They sound essential for survival.
Absolutely. Essential in a tough environment and crucial for keeping a mobile society cohesive.
And tribes operated pretty independently, no central government control.
Traditionally, no. A lot of autonomy. Leaders, chiefs, their power came from different places, maybe controlling an oasis, a trade route, but often it was mainly about lineage, respect, reputation within the tribe.
The sources also mention distinct honor codes and justice systems like that bisha, the ordeal by fire.
Yes, used for lie detection. Traditionally, it gives you a real glimpse into the unique ways order was kept. Quite different from formal legal systems.
Okay, shifting to economics. The traditional livelihood centered on herding, right?
Right. Goats, sheep, and crucially dromedary camels. They were everything. Wealth, meat, dairy, wool. Dairy, especially milk, was a staple food, absolutely vital in harsh conditions.
And the camel.
Yeah.
You really can't overstate its importance, can you? The sources call it a gift from God.
That tells you everything. It was central. Primary food source, especially milk when things got tough. Indispensable transport, even cultural events like races.
Its resilience basically made their way of life possible.
Exactly, in those extreme environments, yes.
And their movements, dictated by finding pasture, water, tied to rain.
Directly tied to rainfall patterns.
Yeah.
If rain was unpredictable, movements were irregular. Where winter rain was more predictable, some groups might even plant a bit of grain along their routes.
Oh, interesting.
And in places like parts of North Africa, with more consistent rain, you saw transhumance, a more settled base, but moving livestock seasonally. So there was diversity even within the nomadic lifestyle itself.
Beyond survival and society, what about arts? The sources mention oral poetry, Nabati poetry.
Yes, the most highly regarded art form.
So having a poet in the tribe wasn't just for fun.
Not at all. Poets had real status. Poetry wasn't just art, it was crucial. It conveyed information, shaped opinions, even acted as a form of social control.
Wow.
It was usually recited in everyday dialects, making it very connected to daily life, not some formal literary thing.
Another tradition mentioned, which might surprise some, is Gazau's raiding.
Yes, described in the sources as a well-regulated, almost traditional habit between tribes.
Regulated. How so?
Well, there's this fascinating account from the early 20th century from William Seabrook. He actually observed a gazoo.
Really? What did he say?
He described it less like brutal war and more like a game. The aim was prizes, camels, goats, and
Yeah.
apparently prisoners weren't treated aggressively.
Huh.
Now, that's just one account, but it suggests traditional raiding might have had its own rules, its limits. Maybe a way to redistribute wealth or test strength without escalating to all-out conflict.
Let's trace this story back. The roots are deep, right? Sources point to nomadic herding, even some agriculture and fishing, way back in the Syrian steppe, like 6,000 BCE.
That far back, yes, with more permanent settlements emerging later, maybe around 850 BCE.
And by the Roman era.
By then, the sources showed distinct Arab tribes had formed from these earlier nomads. A recognizable Bedouin identity was taking shape.
And their income wasn't just herding?
No, historically they also taxed caravans passing through their lands, collected tributes, provided essential transport with their camels' goods, people,
So their mobility was partly necessity, scarcity of resources.
but also an economic advantage in controlling movement and trade routes.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating historical note. Early medieval grammarians actively sought out Bedouins.
They did, when they were working to standardize classical Arabic. They believed the Bedouin dialects, especially the desert tribes, were the purest, most conservative form of Arabic. The best models for pronunciation? Grammar.
That really shows the cultural value placed on their language, even back then.
It does, even by settled scholars.
Okay, let's move forward. Empires. Modernity. How did these impact the Bedouin? The Ottoman period sounds like a time of pressure.
Significant pressure, yes. Those 1858 Tanzimat land reforms are mentioned. They provided a legal basis for potential displacement.
And the Bedouins often didn't register land. Why not?
Sources suggest a few reasons. Illiteracy, sure, but also reluctance to pay taxes, or maybe just seeing written titles as irrelevant to their traditional way of using the land.
And there were earlier Ottoman reforms, too, aimed at weakening their leaders, limiting their trade.
Yes, trying to curb their independence, limit their rural mobility, as the sources put it. Sultan Abdulhamid II also pushed settlement efforts, controversially sometimes settling non-Arabs in traditionally Bedouin areas.
Which caused friction.
Understandably, yes. Sources mention discontent, especially since many settled Arabs in those areas also had Bedouin roots themselves.
So all these pressures led to a gradual shift, even by the late 19th century, towards semi-nomadism.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Partly driven by those Ottoman policies, yes.
And their role in World War I.
Complex. Very. Initially, some fought with the Ottomans, but allegiances shifted for others, famously influenced by figures like T.E. Lawrence, leading them to fight against the Ottomans. It shows their shifting political calculations.
There used to be this view, kind of an older academic Orientalist perspective.
That saw them as fossilized, stuck in the past.
Exactly. But newer scholarship challenges that.
It does. Sources cite work like Emanuel Marx's, highlighting a much more dynamic relationship with cities and towns. He said, the city was to be found in their midst.
Meaning they weren't isolated.
Not isolated relics, no. They were integrated participants in the wider regional economy and society, interacting constantly.
Okay, the 20th century then brought even faster change. Gazoo was still happening early on.
Apparently so, in the early decades. But the big shift towards settled life really picked up speed from the 1950s, 60s onwards.
What drove that acceleration?
A few key things, according to the sources. Shrinking rangelands, growing populations making resources scarcer, and some really severe droughts, like that devastating one in Syria in 1958 to 61.
Making traditional herding much harder.
Increasingly difficult, yeah, pushing many towards settled jobs.
And government policies were a huge factor, too.
Arguably the biggest factor driving sedentarization across different countries. Sources are careful here. Some policies aim to provide needed services, education, healthcare.
But others were more about state control, seizing land.
That's what the sources indicate, yes. Motivated by wanting to control and use land traditionally occupied by Bedouins. Whatever the mix of intentions, the result was the same. Most Bedouins became settled citizens of modern nation-states.
It's interesting, though, amidst these huge changes, the sources mention new hobbies popping up, like raising white doves.
Yeah, alongside reviving older skills like falconry, it's another layer of how culture adapts and evolves, isn't it?
Definitely. Okay, let's take this broad history and look at specific regions. How did it all play out on the ground, starting with Saudi Arabia?
Okay, Saudi Arabia. Considered an original heartland. Ancient ancestry. Groups like the Qatani, Adnani. Sources list loads of tribes and as a Shamar, historically prominent ones.
And massive sedentarization there in the 20th century.
Rapid and extensive, yes. Linked partly to state building, policies like during the Ikhwan movement. Traditionally, you had travel in big clan or tribal groups, using specific tribal areas, diras, with their own wells.
Living in those black goat hair tents, Beit al-Shar.
That's the one. And relying heavily on bartering livestock products for grain, dates, other necessities. Sources mention observations like Paul Harrison's about their incredible endurance in the desert.
Okay, north to Syria. Also an original homeland, right?
Yep.
Syrian desert mentioned in ancient texts.
Yes. And Syria still has a large Bedouin population today. Over 1 million estimated. Mainly herding sheep and goats now.
And that drought, 58-61, hit them hard.
Devastatingly hard. Sources say it really damaged herding as a viable way of life for many. The Ba'ath Authority tried to formally suppress tribalism, annulled its legal status even.
But the state still dealt with tribal structures.
Pragmatically, yes. Often tolerated customary law to keep order. And interestingly, Hafez al-Assad apparently leaned on tribal leaders during the 82 Muslim Brotherhood uprising.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which kind of shifted state attitudes, allowed leaders more influence, especially in managing development projects that benefited their position. Sources also mention regional differences within Syria and how many Syrians in general have Bedouin ancestry due to historical migrations.
Right. Now, across to the Maghreb, Northwest Africa. A different story there. More about migration.
Deeply intertwined with Arab migration over centuries, yes. Especially a massive wave in the 11th century. Nomadic tribes like Banu Hilal, Banu Salam, later Makil.
Weren't they sent by the Fatimids?
There were, yeah. Sent from Egypt against the Zirids in what's now Tunisia. Ibn Khaldun, the famous historian, wrote about their impact, famously and controversially calling them like an army of locusts, claiming they ruined settled farming.
Controversial description.
Very. But regardless of how accurate that bit was, the sources agree their arrival profoundly changed the region. Culturally, linguistically, a major factor in Arabization, especially in rural areas.
They defeated local Berber armies.
Yes, pushing Berber populations more into mountain areas while the plains became more Arabized. The scale was huge, maybe 1 million Arab migrants just in that 11th century wave. You still see the legacy today in Maghrebi Bedouin dialects across the region.
Okay, turning to Israel. The sources give numbers. Quite a drop after 1948.
Significant drop. Maybe 65, 90,000 before, down to around 11, 15,000 after. Recent numbers are around 210,000, mostly in the Negev, but some in Galilee and central Israel, too. They got citizenship in 54.
Sources talk about differences between Negev and Galilee Bedouins, and land issues seem central.
Very central. Displacement of some tribes, like the Jahalin after 48. Then sources discuss Israeli government policies building specific townships, like Rahat.
Which is now the largest Bedouin settlement globally.
Apparently so, according to the sources. And plans like the Abu Basma plan, aimed at recognizing villages, providing services, but also controversial plans like the Prower plan,
Well, that's that.
aimed to relocate tens of thousands of Negev Bedouin from unrecognized areas. The European Parliament actually called for it to be withdrawn. Sources also mention controversial discussions about the Bedouin birth rate.
It sounds like a really complex picture presented in the sources.
It is. You have historical displacement, government policies focused on settlement and services, major controversies over land rights and recognition, but also examples of integration. Bedouins serve as volunteer trackers in the IDF.
Didn't they find the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Famously, yes, played that huge historical role in 1946. Sources also mention UN concerns about forced relocation pressures in the West Bank.
Yeah.
So yeah, very complex situation reported.
Moving to Jordan, their history there is mostly migration from Arabia, too.
Yes, over centuries. And traditionally, they've been seen as crucial support for the monarchy, often called the backbone of the kingdom.
Where are they mainly located?
Spread out. Different groups specialize camel breeders more in the east, sheep and goat herders in the west. Sources list major groups, and interestingly, mentioned a Christian Bedouin tribe, the Hiddazine.
And the dynamic with the government, services versus traditional life.
There's that tension. Government provides services, but sources note some still express preference for traditional elements. Lately, though, there's been more discontent, protests linked to economic hardship.
But the Arab Spring impact was different there.
Sources suggest it was, yeah,
Yeah.
partly due to respect for the monarch, but also existing internal tribal divisions played a role.
Okay, finally, Egypt, concentrated in places like Sinai.
Sinai Peninsula is key, yes. Sources highlight tourism development and urbanization having a big impact there, changing traditional culture, even marriage practices, more marrying outside the tribe now.
Did they benefit much from tourism?
Sources suggest not always equally, often ended up in roles like taxi drivers, tour guides. Sources also impartially report some tribes' involvement in cross-border smuggling.
And land rights are an issue there, too.
A major issue, according to the sources. Traditional users' rights haven't stopped them losing coastal land to hotels development. Their semi-nomadic heritage makes them vulnerable in land disputes. Post-2011 revolution, Sinai saw complex dynamics, smuggling tunnels, then agreements with authorities. A lot going on. And the sources briefly mention other places too, like Lebanon. Similar themes. Shift to settled farming, impact of borders on movement, tribal identity getting linked with sectarian identity there.
Just looking at all those specific tribes named across the sources in all these different countries, it really drives home that the Bedouin aren't one single group, are they?
Not at all. Huge diversity within that broader identity, which also makes getting precise population numbers really tricky today, especially with so many people settled.
So we've traced quite a journey. From ancient desert dwellers managing scarce resources, interacting with empires, influencing language.
To today, a diverse people, mostly settled, navigating modern states, borders, economies, social changes. It's remarkable.
What really stands out from this deep dive is that central tension, isn't it? The pull of a culture based on mobility, hospitality, tribal loyalty.
Constantly interacting with the pressures and opportunities of settled life. National structures. It shows identity and tradition aren't fixed. They're actively reshaped by outside forces, yes, but also by internal resilience, adaptation.
It really puts things in perspective.
And if you think about that long arc of adaptation we've discussed, from influencing classical Arabic and taxing caravans to finding ancient scrolls and tracking, now dealing with land disputes and city life, it leaves you with a big question to ponder.
Which is?
What does the future actually hold for Bedouin identity? Given this incredible history of change, will that pull of tradition, adapted yet again, endure against global trends? Or will desert dwellers come to mean something entirely new in the generations to come? Something for you to think about.